Do 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 do. All right, once again, this is Scott Ryan Paulson, the Rooster of Tucson, here to wake you up to the issues shaping our communities, the decisions affecting our future, and the responsibility we all share to stay informed, engaged, and never stop working to make our neighborhood stronger. Once again, broadcasting live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, aka Cartel Hell. Oh, yeah, we're feeling the burn, baby. Once again, this is the Citizen Soldier Podcast. And whether you're driving to work, wrapping up a long shift, or relaxing at home, or just listening somewhere across southern Arizona, I want to say thank you. I appreciate you making this show part of your day. And this podcast is built for the hardworking people who still believe in their communities. The people who believe in respect, accountability, and personal responsibility. And, the people who understand that every strong neighborhood begins with ordinary citizens who care enough to get involved. Once again, welcome to another Iron Voice Society press briefing. Every week we'll be taking a closer look at the story shaping Tucson and southern Arizona. Discuss the issues affecting our communities, recognize the people making a positive difference, and hopefully leave you feeling a little more informed than where you were yesterday. And, this is about being aware, people. About paying attention to what's actually happening around us instead of allowing life to pass by unnoticed. So once again, settle in and take a deep breath, my friends, and let's get to work. I hope everybody out there had a safe and enjoyable 4th of July weekend. Hopefully you still have all your 10 fingers and toes. And, for a few days, families gathered together. They ran around with sparklers. People fired up the grill, and for a little while, we were able to slow life down and appreciate the people around us. And, sometimes we need those moments. They remind us what we're working so hard to protect in the first place. Families, friends, community. Now that the holiday has come and gone, it's time to get back to building something positive, Tucson. And one of the stories generating conversation right now this week is the announcement that the annual A Mountain fireworks display will transition to a drone light show beginning next year. Whether you like that decision or not, it's another reminder that cities continue to evolve. Traditions change, technology changes, and communities change. And the important thing is it's not simply reacting to those changes, people, because the important thing is staying informed just enough to understand why they are happening and participating in those conversations, that actually shape our city. And speaking of Tucson, I want to take a moment and recognize something that often gets way overlooked. This city is filled with good people, but unfortunately, good people don't always make the headlines, as I say before. Every day there are men and women getting up before sunrise to head to work. Not to get up and look for their fentanyl fix at the bus stops. I'm talking about teachers preparing classrooms before their students arrive. Construction crews already working before the Arizona heat settles in. Those small business owners unlocking their doors, hoping today's the day that business actually picks up. The first responders beginning another shift without knowing what the next call is going to bring. Those people deserve recognition. They are the heartbeat of this city. And sometimes we become so focused on everything else that's going on that we forget to acknowledge everything that's still going on that's right. And I think it's important that we change that. And, that doesn't mean we ignore problems. That's far from it. If there are issues affecting our neighborhoods, we should talk about them. If public safety is a concern, then we should discuss it. And if families are struggling with rising cost or uncertainty, those conversations matter. But we should never, ever allow negative headlines to become the only story we tell about our community. Because they aren't. The truth is, there are thousands of people quietly making Tucson a better place every single day. Even though it's an uphill battle, especially with the cartel running this state, most of them will never appear on television. Most of them will never be interviewed. And most of them, they don't even want recognition. They simply do what they're doing because it has to be done. And maybe that's something we could all learn from. One thing that I believe is that communities, they don't become strong because someone else decides to fix them. They become stronger because ordinary people make the decision to care about their families, their neighborhoods, the next generation. They care enough to lend a helping hand when someone needs it. And that's where real change begins, Tucson. Not in grand speeches or dramatic moments, but in the everyday decisions that people make when nobody else is watching. And as I was preparing today's little briefing here, I started thinking about how easy it is to become distracted. Every few minutes, there's another notification. Ding, ding, ding. Another breaking story, another social media argument, another reason to become frustrated. And before long, we can spend more time reacting than actually living. And maybe this week we should all spend a little less time staring at our phones and a little more time paying attention to what's happening right outside of our own front door. Go for a walk, say hello to your neighbors, go support a local restaurant instead of another fast food chain, go visit a small business and thank someone for the work that they do. Those simple moments remind us that community isn't something we watch on the news. Community is something we experience every single day. And when enough people decide to invest in the place they call home, then good things begin to happen. And that's what this podcast is all about. Not just covering headlines, but reminding ourselves that behind every headline are real people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. And that's a mission worth talking about. And, one thing I want every listener out there to remember is this. No matter what challenges our city faces, we still have a choice in how we respond. We can become frustrated or we can become involved. We can sit here and complain or we can contribute, and those are choices every single one of us makes every single day. That's why I don't believe building a stronger community starts with some grand gesture. It doesn't. It starts with the little things. Holding the door open for somebody, checking in on a friend who you haven't heard from in a while, go support a local business instead of driving past it. Thanking a first responder, show some appreciation to a teacher, helping someone who's having a rough week, go out there and help somebody. Because together, they can create the kind of community most of us want to live in. People often ask, what they can do to make a difference. My answer is always the same. Start where you are. You don't have to change the whole city overnight. Just improve your corner of it, my friend. Take pride in where you live, where you work, and how you represent yourself, every single day. Because people notice. Character has a way of speaking for itself, my friend. And if you carry yourself with integrity, some respect, if you work hard, and if you keep your word, you'll leave a bigger impact than you probably realize. The world needs more people like that. Tucson needs more people like that. And I honestly believe they're already here. Sometimes they just need to be reminded that what they do matters. And as we continue building the Citizen Soldier podcast and the Iron Voice Society press briefing, that's exactly what I hope this show becomes. A place where people can stay informed without feeling overwhelmed. A place where we can recognize the challenges in front of us while never losing sight of the opportunities that still exist. A place where everyday people are reminded that their actions still matter, because they do. And if you become complacent, then don't. Get back up and take a look around, my friends. If you become distracted in your everyday life, you can always hop right back on track, my friend. And if you've been rebuilding your life, then take another step forward tomorrow. Progress isn't always measured in giant leaps. Sometimes it's measured by simply refusing to quit. And I think that's something that's worth remembering. And before we sign off today, my friends, here is your mission for the week. Do one thing that improves your community. Not because someone told you to. Not because you'll receive some pat on the back. Do it because you genuinely care about where you live. And, maybe that's supporting a small business, or, helping a neighbor, or just volunteering a little of your time. Maybe it's simply being more patient with someone who's having a difficult day. Whatever it is out there, do something positive. Be the reason that someone has a better day. You never know how far a single act of kindness or encouragement can travel. And before I leave you today, my friends, I want to say thank you. Thank you for believing in this podcast, and for sharing these episodes, and for taking the time out of your day to come and spend it with me. Once again, the Citizen Soldier podcast continues to grow because of people like you, and I don't take that support for granted. If this episode made you think, or it motivated you, or just simply reminded you to appreciate the people around you, then we've accomplished exactly what we set out to do. And we'll be back with another Iron Voice Society press briefing next week, covering the stories that matter and highlighting the people who make a difference, and continue our mission of building stronger citizens and stronger communities. Once again, until then, take care of yourself, your family, and your neighbors, and never forget, the strongest communities aren't built by perfect people. They are built by ordinary people who refuse to stop caring. Once again, reporting live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, a.k.a. Cartel Hell. That's right. Once again, I'm Scott Ryan Paulson, the Rooster of Tucson, and you've been listening to the Citizen Soldier podcast. This has been the Iron Voice Society press briefing. Until next time, stay alert, stay disciplined, and stay informed. Once again, speak the truth and fear no one. Over and out.